guys, I'm here today to talk about the 5 books I read in the first half of February. It's been a super successful month, and so I wanted to make sure I had enough time to talk about these books, you know, in the space they deserve. So I have one non-fiction book, and that is also the only audiobook I have, and that is The Only Plane in the Sky, An Oral History of 9/11 by Garrett M. Graff. I saw Vanessa over on Split Reads talk about this. Her channel's amazing. I get great non-fiction and graphic novel recommendations, so I really recommend you guys go and check it out. I'll link it up here. So firstly, before I really talk about this book, what I want to say is with books of this nature, I think there's a really fine line between educating yourself so you can understand and empathise more, and being morbidly fascinated by a horrific event. And I tend to avoid books or documentaries on topics like 9/11 because I'm always fearful that the reason I'm interested is for the morbid curiosity and not the knowledge and empathy. But when I heard Vanessa talk about this one, the way she described it made it sound like it was more going for the knowledge and empathy angle and not to titillate and to shock and to you know, cause entertaining horror, I guess. So I thought, you know, this is something I don't know enough about and I would like to, and this sounds like the right way to do that. So this is a book which I listened to on audio, as I said, and it is a full cast audio, which I think really helps. So I personally recommend it on audio. I thought it was really well done. It was over 20 hours, it's quite long, but I really enjoyed it, is an odd word to use. So what this is the author compiled lots of archival audio recordings of people's personal experiences and remembrances from 9/11. He has a really big cast of people who help him pull all that together, and then also over many years he interviewed survivors of 9/11 and spoke to them about what the day was like for them. And he gets all these audio recordings, he obviously transcribes them, and then he decides which ones to keep in, and you're then reading/listening to that in chronological order of the day. So you start in the early hours of 9/11 before the attacks begin, and then you go throughout the day. What this does brilliantly, I think, is it looks at all the experiences of 9/11 insofar as he can, I guess as pertains to the American experience in particular. But what I mean by all the experiences, he talks to people who are civilians, part of the attacks. He talks to people who lost family and friends in the attacks and on the planes. He talks to firefighters, people who worked on airlines, you know, getting these planes grounded, people who worked with President Bush. So this encompasses a broad range of voices, and I think that really helped to piece together the overall feeling of the day, which isn't something one of the biggest emotions from the day, I think, was confusion, which isn't something I'd really considered because I was young and confused myself, and it's one of those things you assume that as a child that if you were older you would understand it, but of course no one on that day understood what was happening. And I think that was really brilliantly articulated, all these voices he pulls together. Sometimes you'll get the real facts, you know, so you'll get told that someone called from one of the planes saying this is happening, like one of the flight attendants, and then you'll hear that the information that's been passed on to other sort of organisations that are making decisions, that information has been passed on incorrectly, not because anyone's doing their job badly, but just because everyone's so confused. One thing that really made me think is how unprepared any country can be for an attack of this nature, because you realise, I guess particularly in a country of America's size, there's so many organisations that would need to be informed, involved, would need to regroup and talk to one another, and it's really difficult to do that on a day like 9/11 because people are struggling to get through to one another on the phones, like the Pentagon's been hit, so you know, one of the biggest resources possible cannot be fully utilised, and that they fear for the president's life, so obviously he has to be kept in the only plane in the sky. I thought it was brilliantly done. I particularly found fascinating something I'd never considered, the fact that they did ground every plane that was in American air, and the fact that they did that in less than 2 hours, I believe, and every plane was asked to land at their nearest airport. They did not continue on to their destination. I think the logistics of that are insane, and the fact that people working, you know, for the US airlines, I don't know what that job role is called, but the fact that they managed that without any accidents is absolutely phenomenal. And I don't think it's something that we necessarily talk about. Like, obviously we talk about, as we should, a lot of the firefighters and the police and the security and the hospital workers, but something we don't consider is there was you know, or we don't consider as much, is that there was a massive fear that there was more planes in the sky with terrorists on, and the logistics that went into getting one of those planes on the ground is insane. I thought this was absolutely brilliant. I guess the only thing I would say that I wasn't as into, which stopped me from giving this 5 stars, is, I guess, the way this is done. The whole point in it is it's an oral history, and so I think in having an oral history, it does jump a lot. That's the whole point. I thought that some of these spoken bits would be much longer, and they're not. It's literally someone will say a sentence, someone else will say a sentence, someone else will say a sentence. So you get hundreds of voices. I think at points more may have been achieved by having people's, you know, people's voices not cut into sections and just let their section run for a bit longer. And also, just this as pertains to my interest, a large focus was on the only plane in the sky, which was, you know, the one the president was on, and I was more interested in how it affected civilians than how it affected the president and the people around him. And that was towards the second half of the book, that became a bigger focus. But I'd really recommend this if you think, obviously it's very, very upsetting, but I think it's well done, and it doesn't feel, you know, sort of morbidly curious or anything of that nature. So yeah, it was well worth a read. The next one I want to talk about is a graphic novel that I was very kindly sent from the publisher, and this is Glass Town by Isabel Greenberg. I really, really enjoyed this, and this is the 3rd full-length graphic novel by Isabel Greenberg, and my favourite. I did not expect it to be my favourite. I've really enjoyed both of her others. I gave them both 4 stars, but I just thought this was so beautifully done. So this is about the Bronte siblings. Obviously we have Anne, Emily and Charlotte and their brother Branwell. When they were children, they wrote fantastical worlds, one of which was called Glass Town, and they made up lots of characters and storylines, and they all joined in and wrote those stories together. And it was sort of their escape from the real world, you know, which was pretty horrifying for them. A lot of their siblings had passed away in quick succession, their mother had passed away, and they were sort of living in fear that, you know, they were going to continue to lose one another, which very sadly they did. And so this book opens with Charlotte being the only surviving sibling as an adult, and one of her characters from Glass Town coming out of the story and sort of saying to her, you know, how you're living isn't okay, you need to look back to the past and re-examine Glass Town, and maybe by doing that you can find some sense of happiness again. And so then a lot of this book is going back into the past and looking at them as children, and also looking at them in Glass Town. So it's sort of split into three sections, I guess. The first being Charlotte with her character in, you know, the present day as pertains to the story. The other being the children when they're writing the story, and you see the dynamic between them, and that was really interesting. Charlotte and Branwell are the oldest, and they have this sort of pairing with one another, and then Anne and Emily are very close to one another, and there's sort of a bit of conflict there, which I thought was really well done. So there's just beautiful pages like this. I love these sort of pages when they're sort of 2 spread, and she does what she did really beautifully in this that I really adored was the use of, you know, in this image you can see that there's books and inkwells and glasses as like structures that they're walking through, so they're like literally building the story, which I think, you know, there's all these little details, like one of the tin soldiers is peering through Branwell's glasses, or I think they might be Branwell or Charlotte's glasses anyway, but yeah, I thought that was really cute. And then you have sections which are actually their story in Glass Town. So there's this sort of fantastical story going, and you know, as they write the story of Glasstown, you see the decisions they made with the story and how that's you know, based on what they're experiencing at the time. I thought there was, what I wasn't expecting, I think the reason I really loved this was the commentary on the Brontes as individuals. I sort of assumed this was going to be really focused on Glasstown and a magical world, and it is, but even in every section on Glasstown, what we're really talking about is the Brontes themselves, of who they became, of how they let one another down, how they lived really restrained and restricted lives and quite fearful lives after losing so many of their siblings, and you know, how that affected their storytelling. And you know, this then comments on the stories each of the sisters then goes on to write. So I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was really nuanced and compassionate, and I'd highly recommend it. And I also love the colour differences between the fantastical world and the real world. So when we have scenes in the real world, they're always quite a muted colour palette, lots of blues and sort of dusky pinks and sort of bruised lilacs. And then when we're in Glasstown, there's lots of bold primary colours and very deep colours. And I thought that was a really, really great decision. So I loved it. I'd highly recommend it. It's very, very good. I'm very glad the publisher sent me a copy. Then this next one, all these next ones actually were all sent to me by the publishers as well, so thanks very much. This is Saltwater by Jessica Andrews, and I was sent this last year. It came out in 2019, and I really wanted to pick it up, and I was a little bit fearful because the premise of this is that the protagonist is a young woman in her 20s. She comes from Sunderland, which is in northern England. She goes to university in London and feels very lost and depressed, and after her grandfather dies, she goes to his cottage in Ireland to try and prepare it for sale and to sort of find herself again. Now that sounded really similar in concept to A Line Made by Walking by Sarah Baum, which I really thought I'd love, but actually struggled with because I found it quite depressing and it made me feel quite depressed whilst reading. So I was a bit fearful this would do the same, at the same time as really wanting to read it. Because, you know, it's a northern voice, it's a young woman's story, a conflict with class, but whether to live in cities or rural locations. I love all those things. So I picked this up, and I thought it was brilliant. I think, you know, she's a writer to really watch. I could sense throughout that this was very drawn from her own life, which I found really interesting. So this is written in a style that I think some people just wouldn't enjoy. So it's told in like really short little sort of vignettes like that. And it is told chronologically, but in every section you start with her, you know, in present day in her grandfather's house in Ireland, but you get very small sections from that perspective, and most of it is going back to her being a child, and you start when she's, I think, around sort of 8, and then there's 3 sections. One is her as a child, one is her as a teen, and then one is her once she gets to London, and how, you know, that eventually doesn't work and how she then ends up in Ireland. But throughout each of those sections you also get small bits when she's actually in Ireland. This is very lyrical, very poetic, and there isn't much plot, if any. It's one of those books you could say the whole story and it wouldn't really spoil your reading experience, because this is much more about the voice, the themes and the commentary. Lots of this is discussing the relationship between mothers and daughters, which I thought was done beautifully. There's lots of sections where she comments on, she was raised mainly by her mother because her father was an alcoholic and a lot of the time wasn't at home. And she comments on the fact that she sort of feels like she wants to like inhabit her mother's body, and she has this sense that the emotions she has for her mother are too strong, they're too much. And she does lots of things like go into her mother's room when her mother isn't there and smell her mother's things. And as she becomes a teenager, the conflict this causes that she starts to try and sort of be like her mother but in her own way. And I just thought that was done really, really well. I absolutely loved this book in the moment of reading it because for me it was really nostalgic. I think the author must be a very similar age to me, and we're both from similar working class backgrounds. I'm not from the north, but other than that our experience is really aligned. So all the sort of food she had was food that we would eat, lots of, you know, like waffles and beans and turkey dinosaurs. All the sweets she mentioned are sweets that I ate, all the magazines she read are magazines I bought, all the music she listened to was music I grew up to, and just lots of the commentary on what her grandparents were like and what the decor was like in these homes she was moving through. That was my childhood experience. So I read this book constantly surprised by the fact that I don't often see that in literature, and I really appreciated it. And as she became a teenager, similar, you know, she was, you know, much more into going out drinking and staying out late than I ever was. I was very well behaved, but I could still see myself in her clothing choices and her music choices and all those things. So I really, really enjoyed that. I think for me, the first section I connected with the most because it was the most nostalgic, but the final section was probably the most successful in terms of an actual novel because it does have a tiny bit of plot. I really enjoyed this. I think because it's an experience more than it is a plot, it's not super memorable because you won't look back on it and be like, oh, that plot bit was really good. But I think if you can relate and you like lyrical writing, then you'll remember it for that. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one as well. Then we have a book I've already lent to a friend, and that is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. So this book was very interesting. Firstly, I just want to say, if you have heard, this book has had a little bit of controversy, which I think I should address right from the start, in that this is a novel about a young girl who begins a relationship with her much older male teacher, and she believes it is a loving and caring relationship, but obviously we as the reader know that it is not, and he's a paedophile, and there's a big imbalance there. And the book opens in 2017 with her as an adult woman being contacted by another woman who says the teacher did the same thing to her and she wants to you know, press charges, and she's asking this woman, Vanessa, to also press charges, and Vanessa doesn't want to because she doesn't believe she was abused. So it's very dark, it's incredibly triggering, as you can tell just from that. The controversy has been that another author who wrote a memoir has come forward and said that she feels that Kate Elizabeth Russell has stolen her story. She thinks that it's too similar to be a coincidence and that the author has read her memoir and then made it into a novel. And I just want to say here, in case you've heard that but not heard the response, I think this is quite a sad thing actually. Kate Elizabeth Russell has been forced to come forward and say, you know, whilst it is absolutely fine for people to talk openly about stories like this if they've experienced it, because there's nothing to be ashamed of, it's also fine if people don't want to. But this attack has forced Kate Elizabeth Russell to have to say, you know, I have experienced things of this nature and the book is drawn from those experiences, and so I haven't plagiarised, basically. And other people have now come forward and said, I've been reading the author's blog for 10 years and she's been posting parts of this book for a decade, so it's definitely her story. So I just want to address that because you may have heard that plagiarism has been discussed, and I just wanted to, you know, say here and now that it's been responded to, and I don't think that's a concern. So like I said, this book is about a very difficult subject matter, and how this works is that you get smaller segments in the present day of 2017 with Vanessa living quite a sad and lonely life in which she's not really fulfilling all the dreams she thought she would fulfill. She thought she was going to be sort of a big literary success, and she hasn't been. And her being contacted about this teacher, who she's still in contact with now, and her promising him she'll stand by him because she doesn't believe it was abuse and she still, you know, has feelings for him now. But that's obviously very difficult to read. And the majority of the book is then her going back to the start of their relationship, which the word relationship means any relationship between two people, but it still feels awful to say relationship between these two, but even a toxic relationship is still a relationship, I guess. So most of the book is told from that perspective, and then the book slowly catches up to the 2017 narrative. Vanessa is 14, she goes to a boarding school in Maine, and that is where she meets the teacher, and obviously he has, it sounds awful, but the access he has to her life is high because she's at a boarding school, she is not near her parents, they cannot see what is happening. From the start you can sense that she's very lonely, she's very desperate to be, sort of to have someone who cares for her, and as soon as this man starts to compliment her and reach out, she then, you know, doesn't recognise what he's trying to do. As an adult reader, this is incredibly difficult to read because right from the start you can see what he's doing, okay? So, my thoughts. I have so many thoughts on this book, I'm going to try and not run on for ages. I think it is incredibly successful at what it is trying to do. It is obvious, even without Kate Elizabeth Russell releasing her statement, that she has had these experiences, because there is absolutely no way in my mind you could get in the mindset of the young girl character Vanessa, or you could show what the teacher's doing. So I don't want to say perfectly, but I don't think without that experience you would be able to articulate it so well. So I have quite a strong stomach for reading awful things, and I thought this book was going to be a real page turner and I was going to read it in like one day. No, I had to walk away from this book quite a lot. In the end I read it over like 5 different days, and I'd read like 60-page chunks and then walk away. This book is explicit, okay? So if there's, you know, if you hear this and you think that sounds awful, but as long as it's not too detailed I'll be okay, it is detailed. There's bits where I felt like I had a physical reaction, like I feel my whole body tense. It was really hard to read, and it's even more hard to read because it's not like when those awful things happen your character is then like, oh my god, something awful has happened to me. She isn't. So that's really difficult. So I think all of that was done phenomenally well. Like, the fact that she managed that is insane. I've never so felt like someone had got me in the exact mindset they planned to get me in fiction. A couple of like small issues I had with it is, firstly, in the first section when Vanessa is very young, sort of 14 to 15, the language is fairly over the top, and initially I was thinking, is this the author's writing style? It feels a little bit MFA, like this is my first book and I'm really going to overdo some of the descriptions to the point where actually if you read them without thinking they sound really pretty, but if you read them more slowly it's like, what does that even mean? So that bothered me a little bit, but then actually that drops away. So I think that may have been intentional in that Vanessa, you know, it's Vanessa's voice, it's first person narrative, and Vanessa thinks like that, you know, she loves English, she loves writing poetry. So, you know, I just want to say that I didn't love the writing style in that first section, but I think perhaps it was intentional. And the other comment I want to make is, whilst it captures that dynamic perfectly, and it captures those two characters perfectly, you know, obviously he's completely unlikable. I don't think that's even worth saying, really. But Vanessa is a difficult character to really like. And I say that not because of the conflict you have about how she feels about her teacher, but because that's all she really thinks about. Even in the 2017 narrative, he has consumed her life, which is a comment she makes in the book. He has completely disrupted everything. He's become involved in her life at such a young age. He dominates. She doesn't know who she is anymore. She doesn't know what she likes or dislikes because he's just told her what she should like and dislike, and mainly it's, you know, like me, dislike everything else. And so other than what's happening to her, there isn't a lot to Vanessa in terms of, she doesn't talk about things she enjoys doing or anything like that. So that's obviously difficult to read, but also intentional. The thing I found with this book that I think was a bit unsuccessful is that other than Vanessa, her teacher, and then a character who becomes a bigger focus later in the novel, all the other characters felt pretty flat. And I get it, because you're supposed to feel like you're trapped in this space with Vanessa and the teacher. You're supposed to feel like she does, like he is everything and she can't get out. But it does feel a little bit like perhaps the author just wasn't very good at building secondary characters. They're not very well developed. There isn't an awful lot of commentary on them. They feel quite flat. So yeah, I think this was brilliant. I think it deserves to be read and spoken about. But I'm intrigued to see what she'd do with another novel, because I think the success of this is entirely based on the story and how well she handles that. and I don't know how well she'd handle another novel, but I'd certainly check one out if she does bring out one. And also, if you read My Dark Vanessa and you think it's brilliant and you want to experience more things of that nature, awful, but there's a film called The Tale, which is based on the director's own experiences, which is also very difficult to watch, but brilliant, and has similar themes, so I'd really recommend that. One of the hardest films I've ever watched, but it is brilliant. Okay, so I've saved the best to last. This has been my favourite read of the year so far. I absolutely love it, and I'll be really shocked if this doesn't make it to my favourite books of the year, even though we're only in February. And that is The Bass Rock by Evie Wyld. Again, the publisher very kindly sent me this. I requested it, so I was very grateful, and I picked this up within a few days of it arriving. I just love this book. This has so many tick boxes for me in terms of themes. So when I first heard the description, I was super excited. And I've also read Evie Wyld's other books, All the Birds Singing, and really enjoyed that. And I also really enjoyed her graphic memoir, Everything is Teeth. So this book is split across 3 narratives. One is in the 1700s, a young girl is accused of witchcraft, and a sort of drunken priest saves her from men in the village assaulting her and takes her to his home, and that narrative is told from his son's perspective. Then we have a story which is post World War II in Scotland near the Bass Rock, and a woman has married a man who's widowed and has 2 young sons, and they move to this sort of large house in this very small village, and she feels very lonely. She's not really sure what her relationship with these boys should be. She doesn't want to replace their mother, but also she does really like them and want to be closer to them, and there's this conflict there. And then we also have a contemporary narrative from a woman called Viv, who is the sort of granddaughter of Ruth in the post-World War II narrative, and Ruth has just passed away, and so Viv has been sent to her house near the Bass Rock to prepare it for sale, basically. And Viv has just suffered a sort of mental breakdown after the loss of her father, and so her family are trying to sort of keep her busy, and they're paying her to go look after this house in order to give her something to focus on, really. Again, this book doesn't have a ton of plot, which is something I really enjoy, but I thought thematically this was phenomenal, and also, so thematically it's phenomenal. It's also amazing in terms of sort of slice of life. The acute detail is brilliant, and I also just loved the commentary of this book. So a really big theme in this book is violence perpetrated against female bodies by males, and also control that men have over women, particularly historically. And so one of the things I thought was really brilliantly done is, as I said, in the first narrative, which you don't really hear much from at all, in Sarah's narrative, it's told from the perspective of a young boy in first-person narration. Ruth's narrative is third person, so you're getting a bit closer to her. Her story's not being told by a man, but it's also not being told by her. And then in Viv's story, it's first person from her perspective. So the closer you get to the present day, the more the female character is given a voice, which I thought was really brilliant. In Viv's storyline, she makes a friend with a woman called Maggie, who's really consumed by violence against females by men that's going sort of unnoticed, and the way it's not being dealt with, sort of domestic violence, women who are killed by their partners, and how it's not being viewed as an epidemic, and it's being dealt with as individual incidents rather than one big issue which should be resolved as an issue. And I thought that was really well handled. I loved it. There's a sort of tiny bit of a ghostly narrative to this, which it is particularly strong in Ruth's narrative in the post-World War II section, which I thought made me feel really tense. And so I love this book, and I think when you have multiple POVs, sometimes you read one thinking, oh, hurry up and get to the other. I never felt that way. I loved them all. My particular favourite was Ruth's narrative. I thought it was brilliantly done. And I think that's just who I am as a reader. It really reminded me that I should read more books set around that time period, because I love reading about that time period, in particular as pertains to the restrictions on a woman's life in that time period, and I thought Evie Wyld did that brilliantly. And this is beautifully written, it's eerie, it's really tense. There's a lot of moments where you're just dreading what the male characters are going to do, and throughout this book, interspersed with all these narratives, you get sort of 2-page vignettes about women who have been sort of violently killed near the Bass Rock. And it's not that the Bass Rock is this sort of mythical location, it's that the Bass Rock is used as an anchor, as this sort of presence that's sort of witnessing all these incidents. But the commentary is that this could happen anywhere, and does. This is not specific to this location, it's just that this story is, but this happens everywhere. It's brilliant, and for a book that deals with a lot of themes, it has, you know, it doesn't get lost in those themes. The characters are excellent, the writing is phenomenal. I think this is so accomplished, and I absolutely adored it, and I would love, love, love more people to read it, and I really want people to talk to about it. So please, if you've read it, it doesn't come out until the 31st of March in the UK, or the 26th of March actually, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So there was that. So thank you ever so much for watching, and thanks to the publishers again for sending me these books. I really, really enjoyed them, and I feel like these books were really excellent books to talk about. They gave me lots to think about, and so I'd love to chat to you about them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!